They literally have a switch that they can flick, and the ICT infrastructure across Gaza is completely gone. And that's what we've seen, right, over the last over a year and a half now of ongoing genocide. Is there's been continual blackouts in Gaza. Now some of those blackouts have been caused by the bombing of infrastructure, but there have certainly been blackouts that have been entirely caused simply by Israel deciding to flip the switch, and they're able to do that because of their control. But I think it's also really important to note that that is a war crime in its own right. When that happens, it is extremely difficult to document any other sort of mass violations of human rights that are taking place. And there is an intense psychological impact on the people of Gaza when they are completely without access to not only the outside world, but potentially friends, family, loved ones. When these blackouts take place, they have no idea if anybody is okay.
Hey folks, welcome to Occupied Tech. This is a collab between Tech for Palestine and Palestine Deep Dive, where we'll be discussing the mechanics of the tech industry and how the tech industry powers Israel's genocide and apartheid and occupation. In each episode, we'll be looking at the companies, the investors, and the individuals in the tech industry's complicity in Israel's apartheid in Palestine. And most importantly, we'll be speaking directly to the people resisting this oppression. Super excited to have our second guest of the series, Eric Sype from Hamle. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you so much. Super excited to be here, Paul.
Yeah, no, you are one of the people that I think is most interesting in the movement, and Hamle is one of the organizations that's most interesting in the movement. I think one of the ones that is maybe least known in the movement as well. So, tell us about Hamle. What do you all do?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. So Hamle is a Palestinian digital rights organization specifically, and our mission is to work towards a free, fair, and safe digital space for all people. And really, we came out of what is often referred to as the Arab Spring, where our founder, Nadim Nashif, saw the potential for online spaces bringing people together to fight for a common cause, and also realized that there was nobody specifically in Palestine. There was no organization, no group of people that were protecting the digital space. And so a little over 10 years ago, Nadim founded Hamle at the time as a entirely volunteer-ran organization. And slowly over a few years, more people started getting involved. It became Nadim's full-time job. We garnered more staff. And now we are a staff of about a little over 20 full-time employees across two offices in historic Palestine, one in Haifa, one in Ramallah, as well as a number of staff in Europe, and myself and one other person in the United States. And we work towards our mission in basically three different ways. One of them is we're continually monitoring and evaluating the digital space and the current digital threats that Palestinians are facing. And we issue publications and reports on that. We utilize that information then to do our kind of second area of work, which is advocacy, which is what I do. We take that information to leaders around the world in positions of power, whether it be politicians, folks in UN agencies, or directly to tech companies themselves. And we kind of provide our analysis and our recommendations. And specifically with companies, when we don't feel like the conversation is going anywhere, we turn to traditional corporate campaigning and accountability strategies to push them to do what we think is necessary to not only respect but also protect Palestinian human rights online. And then the third area of work, which is also extremely important, especially in the current era, is we provide capacity building training primarily to Palestinians. So that looks like civil society groups, student actors, human rights defenders, journalists around digital security and how to ensure that they do everything they can at the moment to keep themselves safe. So that's kind of Hamle in a nutshell.
Cool. So you used a couple of phrases that I think might not be super familiar to some people. Digital threats and digital rights. So maybe let's start with digital rights. What are digital rights?
Yeah, no, of course. Digital rights, kind of a esoteric term that maybe a lot of people wouldn't kind of immediately know, but digital rights are simply human rights as they manifest themselves in the digital form, and that has been reiterated again and again, basically across every major international human rights body and convention. That all of the human rights that you should expect to be upheld in your daily life, you should also expect that they're upheld online. So that looks like freedom of expression. You do have freedom of expression. You have freedom of association, freedom of access to the internet is the most fundamental sort of human digital right, rather I should say, in the digital era. You do have a right to access to the internet. You have a right to access communication in the sort of digital era where we live, where you can reach anyone across the world in a second. Those are all sort of rights that are enshrined within international conventions that should be protected. But you also have the right to be protected from discrimination and bias. And there needs to be specific protections put in place for folks that have a marginalized gender identity. All of those things are things that need to be protected in the online space, and there needs to be specific sort of actions taking place that are different from how you might protect those in the physical world than in the digital world. And at Hamla, we specifically try to ensure all of those sort of actions are in place specifically for Palestinians' digital rights to be not only respected but protected.
So you talked about like freedom of expression. Like how does that manifest in the context of the genocide that's happening, and obviously we've learned a lot of it from social media and from other forms, but are they the kind of digital threats that you're worried about?
So two things there. First off, and I'm sure that we're gonna get into this a lot, but censorship and suppression of speech is one of the most common digital rights violations, and we see this very, very, very frequently before the genocide, and to an even greater extent after the genocide. Folks posting about what is happening in Palestine, and their posts get taken down. That is a digital rights violation. That is one of the most common digital rights violations. In terms of some of the sort of digital threats that we're talking about in terms of trying to ensure that folks are protected, you also have a right to privacy, and you have a right to your data being protected. And there are systems of mass surveillance that are trying specifically to target Palestinians to kind of provide databases of essentially every aspect of their life. And we provide trainings to be able to show folks the best ways that they can maintain their privacy and maintain protection of their data well online.
Okay, I think we're going to get well into that in a little bit. Okay, so before we do, I kind of want to dig into this term you told me about before, which is digital occupation. Obviously, Palestine has been under physical occupation for 76 years. So what's a digital occupation?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really, really important question. And I think a lot of folks, even folks that are very well versed in what is happening in Palestine, tend to underestimate the importance of the digital sphere in the occupation, apartheid, and now genocide. And when we think about this, I think it's important to take a historic perspective. Back in 67, when much of Palestinian territory was occupied for the first time, the Israeli authorities took over control of ICT infrastructure so that Palestinians no longer had control of their internet telecommunications infrastructure at that time. And that has continued through today. During Oslo, the Oslo Accords, that part of the agreement was that over time, the Israeli authorities would transfer control of the ICT infrastructure over to the Palestinians, and that has never taken place. So, if, for example, a radio station wants to be able to open up and operate over a specific frequency in Palestine, they would have to get permission from the Israeli authorities to do that. And we also see that in the occupied territory, they do not have the same level of connectivity. So in the West Bank, for example, it was only recently that they gained access to 4G networks on our phone, whereas myself being based in California, I always have access to 5G network. And in Gaza, prior to the genocide, they only had access to 2G networks. They were one of the only places in the world that still only had access to 2G networks. So we see in that way that not only Israel controlling the infrastructure as a digital occupation, but then they utilize that control and that occupation to create a digital apartheid through not being able to provide the same level of access to networks that is available to a citizen of Israel. And then if you move a step further, then we've seen how the control of this infrastructure and the relationships that Israel has with tech companies that utilize this infrastructure, then in comes the big cloud computing and AI firms, which we can get into this more as well, but they then provide technology that Israel uses to instigate its mass bombing campaign across Gaza, and now we have a digital genocide as well. So if you look through the history, it goes all the way from digital occupation, apartheid to genocide quite clearly, and parallels, a lot of the same narratives and themes that folks will be well aware of in terms of the sort of physical realities of Palestinians.
So talking about the West Bank there, the Palestinians in the West Bank have had access to 3G until recently, and now 4G. What about the settlers? What do they have?
So the settlers have access to 5G networks because they are operating off of a different system. Essentially, the settlements in the West Bank are connected to islands within the occupied territory of Palestine to everything that a citizen of Israel has access to, and so you could be a stone's throw away from a settlement, and as a Palestinian, you would not have access to the same networks and oftentimes even to the same services that certain companies provide.
And this is enforced on the basis of their ethnicity or their citizenship. Like, what's this? What's the specific mechanism that Israel uses to enforce that apartheid?
Well, that's a good question. If you asked them, it would not be necessarily enforced in that way. They would probably likely say, and obviously I'm not a spokesperson for the state of Israel, so I'm making a bit of a guess here, but they would say these settlements are where citizens of Israel live, and so we provide all of the services to citizens of Israel that they would have if they were living anywhere else within the state of Israel. Whereas these communities that Palestinians in the West Bank live in, that is up to the discretion of the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority and Palestinians in general have the ability to come to us to ask to be provided with different access to ICT infrastructure and networks. Now, that last part is the important thing because Israel, at the end of the day, has control over everything, and so they have to. So Palestinians have to go to the state of Israel to be able to gain access to these, and then that allows for a large bureaucratic process that takes a lot of time, that can be held up by a number of different reasons. And oftentimes, the state of Israel can cite security concerns as well for one of those reasons holding it up, which creates a system where Palestinians don't have access to the same networks that citizens of Israel do.
And to be clear, it's not for lack of desire or lack of investment. Like, when as I was learning about Gaza, I learned that Gaza has plenty of investment in it. And you used to have things like an airport, and so it's not that Palestinians don't want or can't afford to install 3 or 4 or 5G, right?
Yeah, no, that's entirely accurate. And also, there is certainly the internal knowledge base and skill set within Palestinian society to be able to do this. Specifically, if we're talking about Gaza, Gazans have rebuilt their infrastructure again and again and again because it is continually bombed by the state of Israel. And when you talk about rebuilding Gaza now in a hopeful post-genocide society in Gaza, oftentimes folks say, okay, well, how are we going to do that? Who is going to pay for that? Shouldn't maybe, I don't know, the Gulf states pay for that? They're large economies that have expressed desire to support the Palestinian people. And again, you'll hear when you talk to folks in the region that know what they're talking about, they'll say, well, this is not a technical problem. The Palestinians know what they're doing. This is a political problem. And anyone that is asked to fund, the first question they will ask is, how do we know this is a good investment? Isn't Israel just going to bomb the infrastructure again? And aren't you just going to be coming to us in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years again to be asking for the same investment? That makes no sense to us. So this is not a technical issue at all. It's not an investment issue. It's a political issue, and specifically, it's an issue of the Israeli military continuing to destroy infrastructure again and again and again.
So when the Israeli invasion in Gaza in 2023 started, one of the more genocidal statements that we heard from Gallant was, we will cut off their electricity, we'll cut off their food and their water. And I think it shocked quite a lot of us that this was a thing that, like, another country is supposed to do, right? Palestine is one place. Why is there? It would be like Mexico is able to turn off, like, the US's water supply. It's absurd. But this is actually the situation, and it's also the situation digitally. The When we look at the digital genocide that happened in the AI, right? We heard a lot about the data extraction and surveillance and that sort of thing, and how it turned into sort of like Lavender, and maybe we'll get to Lavender a little bit later. But it all seems like it all seems connected, right?
Entirely, and it's connected to the history that I was talking about just a few minutes ago, with the fact that Israel has control, complete control over all of this. So they literally have a switch that they can flick, and the ICT infrastructure across Gaza is completely gone. And that's what we've seen, right, over the last over a year and a half now of ongoing genocide. Is there's been continual blackouts in Gaza. Now some of those blackouts have been caused by the bombing of infrastructure, but there have certainly been blackouts that have been entirely caused simply by Israel deciding to flip the switch, and they're able to do that because of their control. But I think it's also really important to note that that is a war crime in its own right, that you cannot cause an intentional blackout of an entire people, and that when that happens, it is extremely difficult to document any other sort of mass violations of human rights that are taking place. And there is an intense psychological impact on the people of Gaza when they are completely without access to not only the outside world, but potentially friends, family, loved ones in another part of Gaza that they don't know. They know bombs are being dropped. They know there's ongoing military incursions. They might know it's not happening where they're at, but they don't know if it's happening where one of their loved ones are at. And when these blackouts take place, they have no idea if anybody is okay. And that gets back to the point around why access to the internet, access to communication is a foundational digital right that needs to be protected.
So, like looking at today, right? So we're June 19th. I haven't checked the news today, but I assume that this is there still a digital blackout? Has Israel still turned the internet off entirely?
As of the last time I checked, there was some access, but it is not complete access. So there's still restricted access, but there is some access available now.
Okay, so there's some access, and what we're seeing is they're setting up these fake aid stations with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, right? And they're killing 50 to 100 people a day. The what's being alleged by Team Palestine is that the two are connected, right? They're turning off this access so that we can't document those war crimes. Does is there evidence that is directly what's happening, that this is something that that Israel confesses to quite a lot on its own news and media stations? Like, have we seen them confessing to this sort of war crime?
To my knowledge, there hasn't been the same level of explicit confession around we cut off the power so that folks can't document what we do when there's no access. But I think based on exactly how you're framing it around many other things that Israeli officials have said very publicly, have even posted online, which I'm sure we'll get to that as well. It's it's a very reasonable assumption to make that that is explicit ploy.
So you were talking earlier about everything goes through this kill switch, right? Or the all communications, as I understand it, in Gaza go through a box that Unit 8200 or whoever's doing intelligence in Israel has access to. Connect that to Lavender for me.
Yeah. So for maybe also just a quick explainer, Lavender is one of the multiple AI programs that the state of Israel is using to instigate its mass bombing campaign that essentially provides a mass trove of data of the citizens of Gaza towards their to their military to identify bombing targets. And we know that, as I mentioned before, they have complete control of the communications infrastructure. So they know who you're talking to. If you're talking on a regular phone line, we also know that they can hear all of those conversations. They can track, even on an encrypted platform like WhatsApp, who you're talking to, who you're in groups with, when you're sending messages. So they might not be able to see the content of those messages, but they can see all what is called the metadata that is connected to that. That would be where you're at, when you're sending those messages, who you're sending those messages to. And they use all of that information to create a profile on individuals in Gaza to essentially kind of create a score of a risk threat of how likely is this person to being connected to a militant group, to determine whether they are, in the eyes of the state of Israel, a legitimate target and a target that they would want to hit. And then these different programs that they have then scheduled the hits. They sometimes, it's as nefarious as the program Where's Daddy, where they literally wait until their target that they have identified as a legitimate target is home, probably around family that is certainly not a legitimate target, and then they bomb the home. And it's very, very, very connected to the fact that they have access to and complete control over all of this infrastructure, that they are able to collect all of this data. On top of which, could be a whole nother podcast, and we can certainly get into a whole host of nefarious mass surveillance technologies at their disposal that is also helping them to collect this information.
Yeah, there's no. We could spend a very long time talking about Israeli war crimes, but maybe this is a good time to segue into big tech and how big tech is actually complicit in it. So maybe like with Lavender, like start us off with like Meta, I suppose, and what other big tech has these sort of complicities.
Yeah, so I think it's really, really, really important to stress exactly how complicit big tech is sectorally across the technology sector in the mass violations of human rights that are happening in Palestine right now. But the complicity is certainly not a one size fits all. It's very different from firm to firm. So, for example, you mentioned Meta. And we already spoke briefly around censorship. I'm sure many folks listening right now may have posted something about Palestine and their post got taken down. They may have noticed that when they posted on Palestine, they had, a fraction of the views on their stories that they usually would have, something often referred to as shadow banning. There's a number of different things that Meta does to censor and suppress speech around Palestine that then obviously drastically impacts global understandings of what is happening in Palestine, especially when Palestinians go to the internet, they go to social media to post documentations of human rights violations that are their everyday reality because they have no other means of getting that information out to the world. When that information is suppressed, that is definitionally complicit in the actions that are being hidden by not allowing for that documentation to be posted. But something else that we see on Meta is the reverse of that, and we've seen high-ranking military officials and as high as the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself of Israel posting explicitly genocidal rhetoric on Meta's platforms that is allowed to stay up. That you can still see right now. You can go to their profiles and see a whole host of explicitly genocidal things they have posted. And part of the definition of genocide is intent to do the things. And by posting this content, they are showing intent. And by allowing for that genocidal intent to be posted on their platforms, by not taking action on it, by not taking it down, Meta is definitionally complicit in the genocide itself. So that sort of control of speech is one way, certainly, that Meta specifically is complicit in genocide.
So presumably Meta has told us why they're doing this. Like, what's their excuse?
Well, there's a number of factors at play here. So if we go back a few years, actually, during the May 2021 uprisings of Sheikh Jarrah, there was a number of forced evictions of Palestinian families in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, and that was one of the first instances of mass censorship of Palestinian content when Palestinians were taking to Meta's platforms to document the human rights violations that were playing out in front of them. And that content was by and large censored and suppressed. There was an outcry over that. Meta's oversight board issued a recommendation that Meta go to a third party actor to publish a independent human rights due diligence report on the situation. That report found that Meta's policies are biased, that they do lead to adverse human rights impacts for Palestinians, that they are over moderating Palestinian content, and that they are likely under moderating Hebrew content. Now, there's a lot there, and everything that I just said has a number of different factors at play in it. One of them is Meta historically has been really horrible at accurately moderating Arabic language content. Arabic language content is the third most of any language across Meta's platforms. So obviously a huge volume that needs to be taken seriously, that needs increased investment to do so. In the 2021 time period, we found that the vast majority of contracted human moderators of Arabic language content did not hold the dialectical expertise to be able to accurately moderate Palestinian Arabic content. Uh, that is one example where there was an obvious problem. It was an underinvestment, and Meta has taken action to try to improve that. That is one of the only examples, really, that I can think of that there was an obvious problem that Meta was called out for, and Meta took action to try to improve. A few other things that have taken place here are some of their policies. On the policy side, they have something that's called the dangerous organization and individual policy, and that is essentially how they designate certain entities and individuals that they do not want you to talk about, primarily terrorist individuals and organizations. And
And
that is
we're using the
a,
American terrorist list, I presume.
what was that?
We're using the American terrorist list, I presume.
Yes, exactly. That is right where I was going. They don't publish that list, so you don't know who's on that list. You don't know who you are and are not allowed to talk about. It has been leaked before, and when it's been leaked, it essentially mirrors the U.S. government's terror designations. There is a huge overrepresentation of Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian actors and individuals. There are humanitarian aid groups that are doing really great work and have no affiliation with any sort of militant group whatsoever that are labeled on that. And because there's such an overrepresentation of these groups and of Palestinian individuals and actors, that is one of the primary reasons why Palestinians' content gets suppressed. So that's kind of part of the way in which the US government influences these things. But the Israeli government also influences these things greatly. And something that we know specifically because the Israeli government publishes this information is that they issue tens of thousands of voluntary takedown requests annually to Meta. That's voluntary. Meta has no legal obligation to abide by these requests, and Meta abides by the request around 90% of the time. So that is Meta allowing the Israeli government to censor content that they don't like 90% of the time. So those are a few of the major reasons that this is taking place. It's a lot more that we could dive into, but I think that gets at a lot of the dynamics that can kind of help you understand what's happening there.
So one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is where Meta and I mean other big tech as well, but Meta in particular censors Americans and other they're not just censoring Palestinians, they're censoring people in the West. They're censoring you and me, users of their platforms who are unconnected to the struggle. And they're censoring what they can and cannot see on the basis of what the Israeli government wants. And in particular, there's a number of individuals who have been identified by news reports, in particular Jordana Cutler, who is what the I don't know Israeli representative to Meta, who it seems has quite a significant amount of power to actually permanently shut down accounts of American schools.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've seen that you can track basically who are the most effective advocates for the Palestinian cause. Those are likely going to be the next targets of censorship and deplatforming. And we know very directly that the Zionist movement is afraid of the student movement across the United States, and that when the encampments started popping up and students writ large were advocating for an end to the genocide and for a very pro-Palestinian message, that that scared the Zionist movement. And then we've seen, by extension of that, there's been an extreme attack against many of these student groups' accounts on social media, and that attack is mirrored as well in some of the actions that are being taken against some of these individuals and groups by the Trump administration currently. And I don't think that that's any coincidence at all. It's also quite scary to note that the US government is now actively scanning individual social media accounts to determine whether they are going to allow them entry into the country or not. And they are obviously doing that in some level of coordination with the social media companies as well. So it gets to an even deeper level of sort of coordination and nefarious sort of actions that are taking place simply for folks that are saying, we want an end to the genocide, we want Palestinians to be free and to be able to express the spectrum of their human rights and their existence.
So you mentioned the dangerous organizations and individuals policy. And that's really interesting to me because, like, essentially what it does is it discriminates against resistance. And just speaking about resistance as a concept, not necessarily speaking directly about Hamas or PIJ, but resistance is something that is enshrined as legal in international law, whereas occupation is something that's defined as illegal in international law. And so it's interesting to me that they have specific policies for shutting down speech about things that are legal, and they have no policies for shutting down or for shutting down genocidal speech or
Yeah, I mean,
pro-occupation.
the first thing that comes to mind there is that we've actually tracked very closely that there have been a number of ad campaigns across Meta's platforms that's paid for placement advertising. So they are synthetically putting content out in a place that it will receive more views and engagement than a organic post would gain, that are advocating for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and that is just allowed to spread across the platform. And there is even a specific campaign that is a Israeli Zionist group that are posting messages in Arabic targeting Palestinians, telling them essentially leave now or else. And those posts are allowed to stay on the platform. And we've actually done a number of experiments where we have gone through and tested ads. So, for those of you that don't know, if you want to put out an ad on Meta's platforms, you have to send it to be approved, which would, you think, mean that they have a higher level of content moderation, which they should, because as I just mentioned, they push this out so that more people see it. So it's vital that it's not that it's not harmful content. And then once the ad is approved, then you can post it. So at Hamla, we've done this a number of times where we've put up things to see if they'll be approved with no intention of ever posting it. And it's some of the most genocidal, horrible rhetoric possible. And basically every time it's approved, oftentimes immediately. And so that really gets to your point around the fact that these platforms are not only disinterested in this content, but they're actively allowing for their platforms to be used to push out a ethnic cleansing message, a genocidal message.
So with Meta in particular, the sort of the question of intent, right? Are they terrible at this? Is there just no money in this? But with Meta, we've actually seen that Meta leadership has been, in various different ways complicit on this. So Sheryl Sandberg, who built Meta, right? Who took what was Facebook in 2010 and built the entire advertising, sales, just the entire machine that is behind the product. And certainly all the policy functions was built under Sandberg. And she's running around now with this you know genocide apology, or pro genocide piece. Screams without words, I think, is what they're calling it. It's a movie that she produced that is spreading these dehumanizing claims about mass rape on October 7th. And so that's something that's like, I mean, it's really bizarre, right? This is someone who's like going absolutely hard to dehumanize the people. And surprise, the organization that she built is also doing the same thing. So is there like a question about the leadership of Meta throughout the organization about this?
So these are facts that we know. We know that Meta gains to the tune of between 30 to 40 billion dollars of profit a year. It's not a resource issue at all. They certainly have the funds to be able to invest much more directly in these things. Uh, we know the independent human rights due diligence report that I mentioned before, it had 21 recommendations for how to ameliorate the situation. And Meta agreed to implement in part or full 20 of the 21 recommendations. And their progress report on their actions, which came out weeks before October 7th, showed very little evidence of doing anything actually to put forward. They made a lot of claims that they have done things, did not show their work. We just have to take them at their word that they've done these things. We also know that civil society has been documenting these issues for quite some time, has been directly engaging in the company, with the company rather, for years, and even months into the genocide, we as civil society actors met with Nick Clegg, who at the time was number 2 at Facebook and in charge of content moderation decisions, and very directly explained to him the issues that we saw on the platform. And we received platitudes and empty promises and no sort of action plan for how to move forward in a better way. So, with all of that in mind, as well as the scale of the problem at hand, it's difficult to understand how this is not intentionally being done.
So we have more evidence than this as well, right? Because we have this report that you helped produce and that Hamley produced, called Delete This Issue. And so this report documents what the workers at Meta who were standing up for Palestinian rights, like what happened to them, the experience they had, what was happening internally at Meta. Do you want to tell us a bit about that and what actually happens internally?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think Delete the Issue, the report points to a lot of really important um, dynamics at play across the tech sector. And actually, one of the kind of scariest things that we saw is many of the repressive actions that these companies are taking. Essentially, all of the companies are doing the same thing inside, and obviously, that's very concerning for anyone that cares about Palestine and understands that this is what's happening if you're a tech worker and you're standing up to say, hey, I don't want my company to be complicit in human rights violations. So what we found was specifically on Meta, Meta basically has the same sort of social media platform that you and I post on that the world can see, but only internally for their staff. So it's kind of like an internal employee social media. And there was even higher rates of censorship and suppression of speech when employees internally were trying to post about what was happening in Palestine, to the extent that, an employee would say, X number of my family was killed over the last week in Gaza. Please pray for me and my family, or send well wishes and thoughts during this difficult time. That would be flagged by another employee and be taken down. Whereas at the same time, a employee that was a citizen of Israel would take paid time off from Meta and go serve in the reserves, and be a military actor in the genocidal military campaign in Gaza, and then come back. And when he came back, folks would post on the platform, "We're welcoming back so and so after their military service in Gaza. We were so willing and happy to support their work while they were gone, and we're so happy to have them back." That is literally the level of discrepancy that we saw internally. And not only was it around the suppression of workers' speech, but also when workers were trying to, through the appropriate channels internally, raise some alarms around some of the issues that we've already talked about that were happening on the external platforms. They were told, "Stay in your lane. That's not your job. Don't worry about it. We'll look into it. Nothing's happening." To the point where some folks continued to not accept that and were fired. And there's been multiple documentations of this happening. And at least one employee has now sued Meta to say that that was wrongful termination. So, I mean, we could talk at length around the sort of inappropriate and toxic environment internally to Meta, but that's kind of a general overview that was corroborated by a number of interviews and testimonies that we documented in the report itself.
And the report also talks about other tech companies. Like we had Hassam from No Azure for Apartheid on last episode, and documented a lot of the same situations that were happening over at Microsoft. Is it every tech company? Is it just sort of the biggest tech companies, or is it kind of like anyone who's above a certain threshold?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the report itself documents experiences of workers at Microsoft, Google, Meta, PayPal, Cisco, LinkedIn, which is owned by Microsoft. I might be missing one, but I believe those are the companies, and those companies right there are a huge chunk of the big tech sector, right? Those represent a very large amount of big tech. And we've also heard, more anecdotally from folks within the tech justice movement, that there are similar dynamics at play at Salesforce, at Oracle, at Intel. So I think we can safely assume that this is the norm within the sector, and that anything outside of that would not be the norm. There are certainly examples of smaller companies that are trying to create a better culture around this sort of thing, but once again, that would not be the norm.
Yeah, I informally did similar sort of thing to what you did with that report. Talked to a lot of tech workers at the start. There was a lot of themes that were similar, and one of the most disturbing themes was the takeover of Jewish ERGs by pro-occupation, pro-Zionist members of those ERGs, expelling in many cases anti-Zionist Jewish workers, and then using those ERGs as as weapons for suppression, for shutting down content, for occupational or pro-occupation policies. And it sort of mirrors what we see a little bit in real life, where, for example, some synagogues are being used to sell occupied land, and land that's stolen from Palestinians is being sold to settlers via synagogues in the US. And there's this sort of like takeover of not wholly, obviously, but a subset of Jewish culture, and not making a space for Jews who do not agree with Zionism. Does the report get into that very much at all?
Um, that is certainly something that we have heard from many folks across the board, and it is referenced in the report, definitely. And something else that we have seen is not only this sort of takeover, as you're mentioning, which I personally know many anti-Zionist Jewish tech workers that have had that exact experience that you are referencing, but that there is also a immediate sort of double standard of Palestinian, Arab, Muslim ERGs to what they are allowed to do versus a Jewish ERG that has a explicitly Zionist political stance. For example, we saw last fall at the 1 year anniversary of the genocide, there was a Palestinians and allies at Microsoft, ERG at Microsoft, that wanted to host a event, and it was approved by highest level executives. And then all of a sudden, there were some Zionist employees at the company that caught wind of what was happening, and immediately it was shut down, and then they were actually not allowed to host any events at all for what was at Microsoft kind of their month of giving. So this is oftentimes when ERGs host events specifically to get Microsoft employees to donate to causes, and Microsoft matches the cause. So it's kind of, from a financial and collection of resources perspective, the most important time for an ERG to be able to be utilized by sort of the causes that they care about. And during that time, they were not allowed to host any events whatsoever.
So this sort of conflation of Zionism and Jewishness is comes up as well in policy, because there's this policy that we've heard of. I don't know the name, but I refer to it as the Zionism as proxy policy, where criticizing Zionism, the ideology that is pro-occupation and inherently racist, and is perceived as an anti-Semitic tool, and can be shut down as an anti-Semitic tool. And we've seen this at Meta, but also this was, to my understanding, forcibly applied over to TikTok as part of the U.S. government's sort of influence operation on, AIPAC's influence operation on TikTok. Is that something where there's actually just tell us how that came about, and why is the policy problematic?
Yeah, so this is something that has a long-standing history that is not just in the tech sector, but kind of everywhere. So there is something called the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and this definition essentially conflates any sort of criticism of the state of Israel as being anti-Semitic, and and any sort of criticism of Zionism as a political ideology as anti-Semitic. And there are a number of actors around the world that are specifically trying to push for institutions to adopt that definition of anti-Semitism to block the state of Israel from legitimate criticism. This is certainly happening in the tech sector, and it came to a head in at least the first instance that I'm aware, actually in 2020, when Facebook at the time was looking at adopting that definition, which would then not allow for legitimate criticism of Israel to be posted on the platform. And Jewish Voice for Peace, one of Hamla's closest partners, came out with a campaign that Hamla endorsed called Facebook We Need to Talk, that was essentially saying Facebook, as anti-Zionist Jewish folks, we need to talk about Zionism. We need to talk about why it's problematic. We need to talk about why it's hurting our community. And there was widespread success at that time. Facebook did not adopt the definition, but it has continued to come up again and again and again, to the point where last summer they decided to essentially create a carve out within their hate speech policy, so that they would say that Zionism is not considered a direct proxy to Jewish, but that if it is very obviously being used in the same context that anti-Semitic tropes targeting Jewish individuals are used, then it can be treated as a proxy for Jewish, and therefore, by extension, and the fact that human moderators have leeway in how they interpret things, will be treated as a proxy for Jewish. Now, this is problematic for a number of reasons, but one of which is all normative understandings of hate speech are identity based in terms of gender, religion, nationality, race, ethnicity. All of those things are things that we should be protected, that you should not be able to attack somebody for. There is no understanding that I'm aware of that allows you to be protected for a specific political ideology. And that is what they have done there. They have carved out a protection for a political ideology and said that it is a proxy for a religious and and ethnic identity that a large portion of that community disagrees with. As I mentioned before, our closest partner across all of this campaigning work has been Jewish Voice for Peace, that has represented a very clear and large community of anti-Zionist Jewish individuals. And that obviously the result of this policy is that it becomes very difficult to legitimately criticize the state of Israel.
The thing that really strikes me about that particular policy is, recently Zuckerberg went on Joe Rogan and he basically said, we're allowing racism again. And he said in particular that there was a number of policies that were no longer to be enforced, and their discrimination policy. You can now discriminate on Meta against LGBTQ people, and I think a number of other classes. There's already one area where they're stretching hate speech to allow this, this suppression of anti-Zionist content. But at the other end, they're saying actually hate speech doesn't really matter anymore. We don't care about that. We're kind of the free speech platform. Free speech platform, except if you're criticizing Israel, alone in any country in the world. You're allowed to criticize America, you're allowed to criticize Ireland, you're allowed to criticize the EU, whatever. But we are banning criticism of Israel because we call it hate speech. But actually, hate speech is okay on this platform other than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an absurd double standard. It shows the hypocrisy very blatantly. And on top of that, one of the few other areas that they are going to continue to actively moderate is the dangerous organization and individual policy that I mentioned. I think when Zuckerberg came out with the announcement of these new policies in the video back in January, and he said, I'm quoting here, that we're going to continue to moderate legitimately bad stuff, which obviously everything that you just said shows that I think both you and I and probably everyone listening would be very skeptical of allowing Zuckerberg to determine what legitimately bad stuff is. But one of those areas is terrorist and terror supporting content, which we know the definition of terrorism, the idea of terrorism is entirely useless because it is not at all looking at white supremacist organizations, looking at organizations that and individuals that specifically by the number are spreading much more terror and violence around the world, and is disproportionately targeting Muslim, Arab, and specifically Palestinian individuals. And that is going to continue to force Meta to censor speech when you're talking about Palestine.
So we've gone pretty hard on Meta here. What about Google? What about YouTube? Is it the same situation there?
Yeah, so Meta very much controlling speech, what is and isn't allowed, how that impacts global narratives, one bucket. There are parallels when we're looking at Google, but it's also quite different. So Google is complicit across a number of different platforms and services that they provide. When you think of Google search, that's probably the platform that is most widely used by people. For many, many years, this is not a new thing. If you search Jerusalem, Google would have told you, still tells you, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. That is an very extremist position globally that is not held by any major government, even with the Trump administration moving the embassy to Jerusalem. It's still not a official U.S. policy, which the U.S., the biggest supporter of Israel, does not have the official policy to designate Jerusalem as only the capital of Israel. And that's because internationally, Jerusalem has a special designation that West and East Jerusalem are split between Israeli control and Palestinian control, with the final sort of designation of Israel to be determined through peace accords between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And so by taking this far right Trump position that they took forever, essentially, that is what I like to refer to as the digital erasure of Palestine and Palestinians. And that is then also manifest in what is probably the second most used Google platform, which would be Google Maps. And if you are a Palestinian in the West Bank, you can't use Google Maps at all. First, it's just not accurate to the landscape, but second, it would be dangerous. And it's dangerous because across the West Bank, they have an apartheid road system where certain roads are only permitted to be used by Israeli citizens, whereas other roads are what the Palestinians are supposed to use. There's no differentiation on Google Maps around that. And also, there are a whole host of checkpoints all across the West Bank that are not shown on Google Maps either. And it is not an infrequent experience for Palestinians to be stopped, detained, imprisoned, harmed, and even killed at those checkpoints. And so if you're a Palestinian trying to use Google Maps, they might take you on an apartheid road that it is illegal for you to be on, and then you have to encounter a military checkpoint that an Israeli soldier is going to say you're illegally on this road, and your life very, very legitimately could be threatened solely because Google Maps is not providing an accurate representation of the geography at all. They also highlight Israeli illegal settlements in the West Bank at a much higher definition, which, by the way, these settlements are, some of them, I mean, all of them only decades old at the most, whereas a Palestinian village that's thousands of years old might not be present on the map at all, or if it is present, you would have to scroll in to zoom to like the closest possible viewing before you would be able to see it. So that, as you can also see, is another way in which they're participating in digital erasure of Palestine and of Palestinian as a people.
So it's funny because Google Maps has a lot of capability around this. Like around the world, Google on Google Maps, occupied or sorry, disputed territories are shown differently depending on where you're using Google Maps from. So if you're like let's say a relatively benign one, right? Nicaragua versus Costa Rica, have some disputed land there, or there's disputed land in sort of the Sudan sort of region, that sort of things that Google has pretty advanced things. Kashmir, another good example, right? It'll show Kashmir differently if you're in Pakistan or in India. But here it seems that they're not picking internationally recognized things. They're not picking US things. They're just picking Israel things and applying that to everyone internationally, regardless of Pakistan doesn't even recognize India. If you're in Pakistan, presumably you're seeing India's representation of India's representation, Israel's representation of Palestine on Google Maps.
Yeah, I mean, you're entirely correct. It really does not make any sense, and there's not a whole lot of reason for why. There's no legitimate reason for why they are doing that, and there have been vague excuses made around the difficulty of demarcating a geography that's ever changing, and military checkpoints are changing, and that sort of thing that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and certainly is not a justifiable excuse for what they're doing. um, yeah, that's what I'll say.
So we're running out of time here. We got good into Meta, into Google. Just so that we don't let them off the hook. Can you give us the list of other companies that have a similar level of really evil level complicity?
Yeah, sure. Some of the worst actors. PayPal doesn't oftentimes get thrown in the Palestine mix, but PayPal provides services to citizens of Israel across historic Palestine, including in the illegal settlements in the West Bank, but they do not provide services to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, which pre-genocide kind of exacerbated an economic chokehold on the Palestinian economy, continues to do that, and post-genocide is creating a huge barrier to be able to allow for humanitarian aid to get into Gaza. So it's a huge problem and would be very easy for PayPal to just open up to the Palestinian market. Cisco has substantial contracts, military contracts with the state of Israel, and also provides services that power mass surveillance systems throughout Palestinian communities, but most notably in what is referred to as the Jerusalem Smart City, which is perhaps one of the most nefarious panopticon sort of mass surveillance systems in the world. Um, we touched on Google, but obviously as well their partner Amazon in their Project Nimbus contract, as well as Microsoft as sort of the big three that are providing cloud computing and AI services that are allowing for the mass bombing campaign at a scale of which we've never seen. We also know that Oracle is providing a lot of services that are being utilized to perpetuate mass violations of human rights. We know that Intel is providing technology that is being used to power some of the most nefarious weapons on the planet that are then being used against Palestinians. Not a big tech actor, but one that is full throated and doesn't hide their complicity in any way, shape, or form would be Palantir. And they're not big tech just because they're a slightly smaller company, but they really are trying to provide the most nefarious technologies in the world. And they explicitly, their CEO says, if you're our enemy, sometimes we're going to kill you. So those are kind of the top that come to mind. across essentially every social media platform in some way, shape, or form to some extent is censoring and suppressing pro-Palestinian speech while allowing hateful rhetoric from a Zionist perspective to spread on its platform. So that's kind of the abbreviated summary of the top actors that come to mind.
Yeah, the what comes to mind to me in each of the ones that you mentioned there's typically some equivalent to how they're stripping the digital rights, or in some case, the physical human rights at home as well, with the Palantir, for example, powering surveillance of Americans to determine their social media opinions, as well as being involved in the attacks on migrants, partnerships with ICE, that sort of thing. Similarly, we're seeing a lot of these social media networks roll over for the Trump administration in the same way that they've been rolling over for the Israeli administration. So it's like real imperial boomerang stuff there. Before we go, Hamle, how do we support your work?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question. So if you go to www.hamle.org, we have a donate page, and Hamle, it's important to note for many of our listeners that Hamle is spelled 7 AMLEH. So that's how you spell Hamle there. And we have a direct donation page that we accept one time as well as monthly donations. We really appreciate when folks can make it monthly, because that makes our funding that much more sustainable. But that is also where you would go to find all of our publications, many of which we talked about today. You can also follow us across all major social media platforms at Hamle, and keep up with the ongoings. There we will post when we are publishing reports and when we are launching campaigns. And when we launch a campaign, we have some way for you to support and act on the campaign as well. And we would really appreciate it if you did that as well.
All right. Thank you so much. Eric Sype from Hamle, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, Paul.
At Palestine Deep Dive, we're on the front lines, producing fearless, independent journalism that exposes the systems enabling occupation, apartheid, and the rise of digital surveillance state which threatens us all. We can't do this alone. We rely on your support to keep going. To keep challenging power and exposing the truth, please join us by becoming a subscriber for just £2 a month at PalestineDeepDive.com/support. Let's build something powerful together.